efforts in other locations. An NGO worker, for example, was injured in hostilities in Aleppo Governorate. It is critical to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm, including to aid workers. Mr. President, in total, more than 540,000 people have now reportedly fled to Syria from Lebanon since late September, more than 500,000 people. An estimated two-thirds are Syrian. More than half of this number are children. Over 7,000 are pregnant women, and about 40% of arriving households are headed by women. The key needs of those arriving to date include food, household items, shelter, health assistance, protection, and legal support. United Nations agencies are working alongside the Syrian Arab Crescent, Red Crescent, and other partners to provide their basic needs at the border and at places of onward movement. Our colleagues from UNHCR, as the Deputy Special Envoy has said as well, are monitoring and assessing those in need. However, since the launch of the $324 million UNHCR-led interagency appeal in early October, we have received only $55 million, or that's what's projected in the pipeline. Humanitarians are doing what we can, including with existing resources on hand. But this is not sustainable in a country where 16.7 million people, more than 70% of the population, are already in need of assistance. While we welcome the contributions made to date, while we are grateful to donors for their generosity, we urge donors to step forward with more funding. There are already reports of some Lebanese families returning to Lebanon due to lack of services and poor living conditions in Syria. UNHCR is continuing to monitor the situation, which further illustrates the impossible decisions displaced people are often faced with. Mr. President, more than 100,000 people have arrived in the northeast of Syria. This is adding to needs in a region where 3/4 of the population already requires humanitarian assistance and where conflict and other drivers of needs continue. Late last month, an escalation in hostilities in the northeast killed or injured dozens of civilians. Damage to civilian infrastructure disrupted access to water, electricity, and fuel for hundreds of thousands of people. And several humanitarian partners were forced to temporarily suspend their activities. The region is also facing an emerging outbreak of suspected cholera, with over 270 suspected cases and 1 death reported to date in the northeast. Many of these cases are in Al-Hol camp, where tens of thousands of people, again, most of them women and children, are living in crowded detention-like conditions. The lack of adequate testing facilities in Al-Hasaka, along with declining resources for health services, poses a serious risk to containing the cholera outbreak. Meanwhile, an estimated 7,800 people fleeing Lebanon have arrived in northwest Syria, where needs, displacement, and civilian casualties are already high as a result of hostilities. Mr. President, members of the Council, already facing staggering levels of need and overstretched humanitarian services, host communities are pressed even further. Our partners have described a family in Homs that was already facing severe food insecurity, hosting some 20 family members who have fled Lebanon. Or a classroom in Aleppo, designed for up to 45 students, now overflowing with more than 70 children. These are communities where humanitarian assistance has already had to be dramatically scaled back. Funding for the humanitarian response plan stands at only 28%, and about 2 million fewer people are receiving critical aid each month now, more than a year ago. The impact on food security is particularly alarming. Nearly 13 million people already facing food insecurity in Syria. This is the 5th highest total globally, while the WFP has been forced to reduce its assistance by 80% in the past 2 years due to funding cuts. Worryingly, the latest hunger hotspots report issued by the World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization, identifies Syria as a country of very high concern among the 12 countries most at risk for further deteriorating conditions in the coming 6 months. As the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Syria and the regional humanitarian for the Syria crisis warned in a joint statement last week, unless more funding is received, consequences will be dire. More funding is needed to help some 2.5 million people withstand the winter months which are setting in. The situation is particularly serious for displaced people in camps and informal sites. In northwest Syria, some 1.4 million internally displaced persons require urgent assistance, including 730,000 people still living in tents. Again, women and children who make up majority of these people stand to suffer the most. Without additional funding, respiratory infections and hospitalizations are likely to surge, particularly among young children, even as health assistance has been scaled back, and millions of children will lose out on school due to lack of heating. Mr. President, the serious limitations on resources have make direct and efficient humanitarian assistance via all available routes even more essential. In this regard, I welcome the government of Syria's extension of permission, as the Deputy Special Envoy also highlighted, for the United Nations to use Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings to deliver assistance from Turkey to northwest Syria until 13 February 2025. The cross-border operation is a critical lifeline for nearly 1 million people a month in Idlib and northern Aleppo. Funding shortfalls also reinforce the importance of strengthened investments in early recovery assistance under the Humanitarian Response Plan and the new early recovery strategy. For example, investing in rehabilitating irrigation systems will allow for greater food production and expand agricultural livelihoods. Critical, given this year's wheat harvest is expected to be nearly 50% below the pre-crisis level. Critical also because of the food insecurity numbers I shared earlier. Similar interventions are needed in health, water, education, and energy sectors, all of which have been decimated by years of conflict and crisis. Finally, Mr. President, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria underlines the importance of sustained progress towards peace in Syria and across the region. We once again urge for support for the Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to facilitate a political solution in Syria, an essential step towards ending this decade-long humanitarian crisis and enabling the people of Syria to rebuild their lives and restore hope for a better future. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wazornu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Sorsan Abu Zainuddin.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, 13 years ago, we, brave Syrian women and men, took to the streets claiming what's rightfully ours, a say in how we live and how our country is governed. Our message was clear.
Syria is ours, and it is not the property of the Assad family.
13 years on, thousands continue to demonstrate in the streets of Sweda, undeterred by intimidations. For over a year now, they have been asserting that Syria is ours and is not the property of the Assad family, or, for that matter, any of the de facto authorities that have emerged in the past 13 years. Protesters in Idlib, Aleppo, Qamishli, and Deir ez-Zor, and beyond echo this sentiment. In the years between these two moments, hundreds of thousands of us have been killed. Tens of thousands forcibly disappeared or tortured to death, and millions have been displaced. Those who remain live in a fragmented Syria, ruled by de facto authorities, including that of the Assad regime, who rules by force and not by legitimacy. But I'm not here today to recount atrocities you know very well, nor am I here to steer your emotions or appeal to your sense of humanity. We are beyond that. I am here today to say that we are invincible, even in the face of your contentious politics. And I'm going to explain why and propose that we leverage this determination to break the political deadlock that we all face. Members of the Council, let's speak accountability. When Russia and China vetoed this Council's resolution to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court in 2014, we persisted. We found creative workaround to the limitations imposed by this Council's political dynamics. Our documentation and advocacy led to the creation of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the first UN accountability mechanism of its kind. And this paved the way for all of us to use universal jurisdiction to pursue accountability. Thanks to the relentless efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders, including women-led groups, today, perpetrators are facing trials in the courts of the world, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in the US, and in the UK. And thanks to the same efforts, the Netherlands and Canada brought Syria to the International Court of Justice. And members of the Council, exactly a year ago, in November 2023, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling demanding Syria end torture, a call the regime has blatantly ignored. And as Syrians stood outside the ICJ that day demanding accountability, they were still fighting for the creation of the independent institution on missing persons, for their right to truth and justice. And yes, they did have the General Assembly establishing that last year. On chemical weapons, a crime that shocked the world, we didn't give up either. Despite Russia's repeated vetoes, our determination to seek justice remains persistent. In fact, tomorrow in The Hague, Syrian civil society will host members of the international community in our second conference on chemical weapons, where we will highlight progress in this regard. Our collective efforts, the collective efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders have led to two historic developments. First, the international arrest warrants for Bashar al-Assad and others, holding them accountable for their role in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This marks the first ever warrant issued by a foreign court against a sitting head of state for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a groundbreaking precedent. And second, the first of its kind working group to advance proposals for criminal accountability for chemical weapon use, consisting of states from nearly every region of the world coming together to say no to impunity. Members of the Council, the political dynamics have also hindered access for millions of Syrians to aid, but not our will to act. After last year's earthquakes, it took a week for the UN to secure the Syrian government's permission and approval to open border crossings into northwest Syria. An entire week, when every second counted. During that critical time, our own white helmets, alongside tens of humanitarian Syrian organizations and voluntary groups, were the only responders. We did our utmost when the United Nations of this world hesitated, despite legal scholars affirming that it had the authority under international law. But politics prevailed. And then came the Russian vetoes to end cross-border aid altogether, pushing the UN to a consent-based model, granting the Syrian regime power over aid delivery across Syria. This is a regime with a track record of deadly sieges, of obstructing cross-line aid, of tampering with humanitarian convoys, stripping them of life-saving medical supplies. A regime notorious for its innovative methods of aid diversion has been, in practice, granted a de facto veto power over Syrians' rights to humanitarian assistance by this Council's politics. So yes, it is all politics. Yet, on the one issue that requires political resolve and diplomatic ingenuity, this Council remains paralyzed. Members of the Council, I'm speaking of Resolution 2254. For 13 years, the international community has complicitly politicized every technical aspect of the Syrian conflict, empowering the regime and leading Syria into a political stalemate. Meanwhile, it has depoliticized the conflict root causes, fueling calls to normalize with this narcotic regime under the guise of pragmatism and humanitarian necessity. Resolution 2254, born in this very chamber in 2015, has been systematically undermined by your passive approach to the conflict's political core. Let's not forget, Syria's conflict did not emerge from a vacuum. It began with a regime massacring its own people, the same regime you're thanking today for opening borders and crossing points. Today, the political process is stalled, reduced to a futile constitutional path, and worse, it's diluted by multiple trajectories regionally and internationally to normalize with the regime. But it's in this context that Madaniya came into being, a collective of over 200 organizations with members and representatives present with me here today, working across all regions inside Syria and across all sectors, inside Syria and the diaspora, and coming together to reclaim political agency to our civic space. Not to replace any of the Syrian bodies engaged in the political process, but to assert our rightful role as civic actors in shaping the political future of our country. And to propose that we use all leverage to incentivize a genuine political solution. Members of the Council, two files, early recovery and refugee return, are critical here. While sustainable aid through early recovery is overdue, entrusting the Syrian regime with it undermines efforts for political progress. You are tampering with power dynamics on the ground. You are supposed to be exerting pressures on the regime to cooperate in the political process, not granting it critical files to fortify its grip of power over the lives of Syrians. Early recovery should build the foundations of a principled state, not restore a criminal regime. Support must invest in building and bridging local institutional infrastructure, including that of Syrian civil society, across all regions, based on a human rights conditionality, to rebuild Syria as a whole on a foundation of sovereignty and national ownership claimed by its own people, not by regimes who hold power through the rule of repression and violence. Similarly, refugee return must be voluntary, safe, and dignified. Yet, some member states misrepresent forced displacement as voluntary returns, portraying Syria as safe and using displacement as a tool for normalization. Those fleeing Israeli attacks in Lebanon or deported from neighboring countries are not returning home. They are being forcibly displaced. This demands a nuanced response, ensuring support and protection to those in need while addressing the root causes to create conditions for a voluntary return. And how so? By incentivizing the political process. Members of the Council, I will leave you with three messages. First, Stop tampering with power dynamics through your passive political approaches. Your inaction is undermining Resolution 2254, empowering war criminals and worsening the situation, not just for us, but for the region, the international order, and ultimately for you. Second, leverage technical files to incentivize political progress. Demand irreversible concessions that can push the political process forward. Aid and accountability have been politicized to empower the Syrian regime for long. It's time that you ask how they can be used to shift power dynamics in favor of the Syrian people. And finally, work with us. We are the stakeholders in the future of Syria. We are the future of Syria. Any political settlement that's concluded at our expense, that denies our rights and dignity, will inevitably fail, because we will not rest until we claim back our state of citizenship and democracy.
I thank Ms. Abu Zainuddin for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start my statement, I would like to express deep regret that the UK presidency, with the neo-colonial spirit that is present in London, sought deliberately to politicize our debate. This is a direct provocation by inviting a rapporteur who is just putting forward a purely complex, phantom-like thoughts about the situation regarding her compatriots, people who are successfully living their lives in peace under the leadership and control of the Damascus authorities. We have had an excellent opportunity to believe that this particular rapporteur has no understanding whatsoever of what is currently going on in Syria. This is a gross lack of respect for the members of the Council, and it's a disdain for the principles that should underpin the work of the UN Security Council. We would like to express our sincere protest against this, and we are going to ask for explanations. And also, we would urge you not to forget that the Security Council of the United Nations is not one's own area where there is impunity reigning, or a family that can just push forward the views of the Anglo-Saxons alone. So, pushing forward the views of these blinded Anglo-Saxon colonials. We would like to thank the Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Najat Rojdi, and the Director of the OCHA for their view of the political and humanitarian situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We have to note with regret that Syria, our friendly country, is increasingly finding itself dragged into an expanded confrontation in the area of the Arab-Israeli conflict. This has been confirmed by what we have just heard from the reports today. The Israel Defense Forces are continuing to carry out intensive, indiscriminate strikes on civilian infrastructure, including on homes. On the 20th of November, at least 36 people died and more than 50 people were injured as a result of the Israeli strike on Syrian Palmyra, as a result of the air raid of the Israeli Air Forces on the 14th and 15th of November in the region of the capital, Meza, and the outskirts of Quds. 15 Syrians died, including women and children, and 16 were injured. It is lamentable that as part of their comprehensive support for Western Jerusalem, the US is harnessing its military contingents in the areas across the Euphrates and at Tav, areas that are illegally they're illegally there under the excuse of fighting terrorism. The bleak prospects for this fight are further worsened by the approaches taken by Western countries to the situation in Idlib that is under the control of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorists. This is a listed group by the UN Security Council. Washington's policy to maintain its de facto occupation of broad areas in the northeast of Syria and the plundering of its oil, gas and agricultural resources is leading to a worsening of the socio-economic situation and a stepping up of the extremist underground in the Syrian Arab Republic. Thus, according to reports, the HTS terrorists once again are upping the ante on their plans to prepare attacks against Damascus and organizing provocations, including with the use of chemical weapons. As previously, these terrorists are acting on tip-offs from the Western Special Services, which have now been joined by Ukrainians. The special services of the Kiev regime. We are still convinced that the path to stabilization in the Syrian Arab Republic is possible only through stopping the military foreign presence, which is there in violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and by a cessation of airstrikes on Syrian territory. Distinguished colleagues, as the briefers have told us today, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely serious. More than 70% of the population needs assistance. The level of malnutrition over the past 5 years has increased threefold, and the cost of living over the last year alone has increased twofold. The people's access to water and clean drinking water could be better, and this is because of serious concerns because of recorded cases of cholera in some areas of Syria. All this proves that the difficult process is there, that the process of establishing recovery in the country is very difficult. The flow of refugees fleeing the hostilities of Israel from Lebanon don't fill us with optimism and places a heavy burden on the Syrian authorities. Over the past 2 months, more than 540,000 people have fled to Syria from Lebanon, and most of those are fleeing to the areas under Damascus's control. This clearly shows that people feel safe where the rule of law reigns, as opposed to terrorist disorder and anarchy. The figures speak for themselves, as if however our Western partners try and present the situation otherwise. We welcome the efforts of the Syrian government and local communities that are doing all they can to ensure the basic needs of the new arrivals. There has been entry rules simplified. There are temporary shelters that have been set up, and work to educate people is underway. Local authorities are helping the UN and NGOs to work at the border crossing points in an unhindered fashion. As regards the broader humanitarian context, then we clearly see the resolve of the Syrian authorities to help all Syrians without exception, including those who are in the areas not under government control. Damascus once again extended, up until the 13th of February, authorization to use the border crossing point Bab al-Salam and Arai to bring in assistance from Turkey. Bab al-Khawa is also continuing to work. We would urge the humanitarian organizations, OCHA and the UN Secretariat to take into consideration Damascus' constructive approach and to step up work on providing necessary assistance inter alia by hosting refugees. It's important for UN structures to bolster their cooperation with local authorities and to coordinate as much as possible with them on the ground in full compliance with the internationally recognized humanitarian principles. There's no place here for politicization when we're talking about assisting people whose right to development and dignified lives exist. humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, coordination, the principle of consent. This should be the very basis of the work of the UN. Especially because the Syrian authorities not only totally openly state that they're prepared to cooperate based on this, but their actions prove it as well. And right now, unfortunately, we don't see any breakthrough from the UN in that particular area at the moment. Cross-line routes for the supply of humanitarian assistance have still not been established. Work with donors is not rendering the needed results. The humanitarian appeal is financed to the tune of only 28%. The disgraceful UN Secretariat parameters and principles for humanitarian assistance in Syria that play into the anti-Damascus narrative of the Western countries has not been recalled. Furthermore, we note that the UN Secretariat has published a new, very categoric in terms of its contents, a new document, namely the Early Recovery Strategy for Syria 2024-2028. At first glance, it obviates the need for getting consent from the Syrians to implement relevant projects in the territory of their own country. Instead of that, the document refers to the fact that the UN has the right to conclude contracts with any local partners and attract financing to two separate funds for the areas under the government's control and the areas not under the government's control. We still need to examine how this strategy is going to impact the humanitarian work of the UN in Syria. And we will give you our views later on. There's something else that is directly linked with the dire situation facing the Syrians. It is the trauma of the sanctions that have been unfurled against the Syrians. Once again, we would urge the UN representatives not to ignore the fact of the negative impact of illegal sanctions on the socio-economic situation of the country. In this regard, we would urge everyone to participate in the UN Security Council meeting under the area formula that Russia will conduct on the 25th of November on the humanitarian impact of unilateral coercive measures. Distinguished colleagues, our position on the Syrian settlement is unchanged. We are in favor of strict compliance with the provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, proposing a political process conducted by the Syrians themselves with the mediation efforts of the UN, to which there is no alternative. We consistently reiterate the need to continue direct inter-Syrian dialogue within the Constitutional Committee. Its work is at a standstill because of the difficulties in selecting a venue for the meetings. We're convinced that it is the Syrians themselves who should choose this platform, in cooperation and conjunction with the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General on Syria and in coordination with the guarantor states of the Astana format, Russia, Iran and Turkey. In this regard, we would like to draw attention to the outcome of the 22nd International Meeting on Syria in Astana, conducted with our partners under the Astana process, Iran and Turkey, on the 11th and 12th of November. During that meeting, in particular, once again, the leading role of this format was highlighted in terms of promoting a sustainable and long-term settlement of the Syrian crisis, given the escalation of tension in the Middle East. Furthermore, on the sidelines of the meeting, there was another meeting of the working group on the release of detainees and hostages, and on the transfer of bodies of those who died, and on the search for the missing. We will continue to work with our partners in the Astana format in the interest of a comprehensive stabilization of the situation in Syria and surrounding Syria. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement and give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Director Warsonu, for your briefings. And Ms. Zainadine, thank you for your powerful and precise presentation. Your remarks will resonate in this chamber for some time to come. I hope the Assad regime's puppet masters were listening carefully. And as we've heard, the truth clearly struck a nerve. The United States remains deeply concerned about the plight of vulnerable individuals, Syrian, Lebanese, and otherwise, who have been displaced by the current conflict in Lebanon. We are closely monitoring their well-being and treatment, and we applaud the work of UN agencies and other humanitarian partners who are doing their utmost to provide aid to those in need. At the same time, we are concerned by ongoing reports of the Assad regime's abuses, including against Syrians displaced from Lebanon, of Syrians who have faced arbitrary detentions, disappearances, forcible conscription, and death while in regime custody, reportedly due to torture. We are also concerned with the escalation of Russia-backed attacks in northwest Syria that have killed and injured scores. These human rights violations and abuses demonstrate that the regime, which has a long history of oppression, has not changed its ways and is seeking to rehabilitate its image by exploiting humanitarian disasters and regional crises. The reality, colleagues, is that Syria remains unsafe and unsuitable for large numbers of returns. We must reject the flawed notion that certain parts of the country are safe for large-scale returns. The best way to enable the voluntary return of refugees is for the Assad regime to create the conditions needed for return, which will require bold political leadership and inclusive political processes. This includes the elimination of Law 10, as well as accountability for the missing and detained, among others. Refugees must not be expected to return until they see a safe future for themselves and their children. In the meantime, we continue to support UNHCR's efforts to improve the protection environment in Syria for over 500,000 people it estimates have crossed from Lebanon since late September. As we continue important work to help the most vulnerable refugees, internally displaced persons, and host communities, we once again urge other donors to help fill the significant funding gaps. It is worth repeating that the U.S. sanctions program against the Assad regime contains numerous exemptions and licenses specifically to facilitate humanitarian aid, and that we are committed to working with humanitarian partners to mitigate unintended impacts on their programs. We would also point to Resolution 2664, which established a humanitarian carve-out across UN sanctions regimes. This resolution was an important step forward to ease the delivery of food, medicine, and humanitarian aid to those most afflicted in conflict zones around the globe, while upholding robust sanctions. We are compelled to make this point because the regime and certain council members falsely claim on a repeated basis that U.S. sanctions are the primary cause of Syrians' economic suffering, when in fact it is the Assad regime's war against its own people, destruction of Syria, and long-term and pervasive corruption that only benefits the elites. Separately, we wish to highlight persistent needs at Al-Hol and Raj displaced persons camps, as well as at detention facilities in northeast Syria, housing former ISIS fighters. There are still 42,500 displaced persons and 9,000 foreign terrorist fighters currently residing at those camps and facilities. Ultimately, the only long-term durable solution to the challenges of these displaced persons camps and detention facilities is the repatriation or return of both displaced and detained persons to their areas or countries of origin. Only there can they be effectively rehabilitated and reintegrated into their communities and, where appropriate, prosecuted. Turning to the political process, we continue to support Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to advance it. To that end, we reiterate that U.S. sanctions will remain in place until there is, at a minimum, concrete, measurable progress toward a political solution in line with Resolution 2254. We underscore this point again and again because we want to see an authentic and sustainable political process. We stress once again that the Assad regime must curb the destabilizing activities of Iran and its proxies in the region. It is telling that instead of sitting down with the opposition and forging peace, the regime prefers to lend out its own country to Hezbollah and other terrorists. It is time for Assad to focus on the needs of his own people, rather than his sponsors in Tehran who wish to use Syria as a launching pad. The United States will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself from threats in Syria. To prevent further escalation and expansion of conflict in the region, the United States will continue working with our diplomatic partners toward resolving tensions. And finally, Mr. President, with regard to charges from some about Western exploitation of Syrian oil and other natural resources, these allegations are patently false. Syria's natural resources are there for the benefit of the Syrian people. The United States neither seizes nor sells any Syrian oil, wheat, or other commodities, including from northeast Syria, where our troops are present. To the contrary, the United States has provided millions of dollars worth of assistance to communities across northeast Syria, helping them restore essential services, generate livelihoods, and build businesses. In fact, it is the regime that owes an explanation to the Syrian people about how its natural resources have been misused. It is they who should explain why the proceeds of the country's sovereign wealth end up not in the hands of average citizens, but in Moscow and Tehran. It is they who should explain why virtually any successful business in regime areas gets shaken down for bribes or forcibly sold off to regime cronies. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Mr. President, I thank Deputy Special Envoy Najat Roshdi and the Director of Operations and Advocacy of the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs, Idem Wasorn, for their briefings. I also take note of Ms. Sasan Abu Zanedin's comments. Switzerland welcomes the commitment of civil society representatives to the political process and to reconciliation among Syrians. A commitment to peace at all levels is indeed necessary. Switzerland condemns the current escalation of violence and the fact that more and more civilians and civilian property are being impacted by bombings and other attacks throughout Syria. This spiral of violence must end. Switzerland is committed to ensuring that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. This includes, in particular, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. Serious violations of international law in Syria must not go unpunished. Switzerland joins in the Special Envoy's calls against the extension to Syria of the hostilities underway in the Middle East and neighbouring Lebanon, and calls for a lasting resolution of the conflict on the basis of Resolution 2254. We take note of the recent statements by the Astana guarantor states in favor of such a solution. An imminent resumption of the work of the Constitutional Committee, as well as the establishment of a nationwide ceasefire, would send crucial signals in this direction. Finally, the right of relatives to know the fate of missing persons as a result of armed conflict is a rule firmly anchored in the Geneva Conventions. It is also an essential element in achieving lasting peace in Syria. The independent institution for missing persons based in Geneva, whose mandate is strictly humanitarian, must be able to begin its work rapidly in collaboration with the Organization of Relatives of Detained and Missing Persons and with all actors concerned in Syria and at the international level. Mr. President, after 13 years of conflict, the situation continues to deteriorate. Syrians are paying the price. Unfortunately, as the months go by, the humanitarian situation continues to worsen. Food insecurity, access to health care, essential needs are constantly on the rise. In the coming months, these needs will be exacerbated by the harsh winter. At the same time, the intensification of violence throughout the country is challenging the work of humanitarian actors on the ground. In the face of these acute needs, all means of access to people in need across the front lines, across the borders, and inside Syria must be used. We welcome the continuation of UN humanitarian operations via the Bab al-Salam and Al-Ray crossing points, which have been authorized for use for a further 3 months. We call on the Syrian government to extend these authorizations, including that for Bab al-Hawa, without any time limit. This is to ensure the predictability needed for a full and effective humanitarian commitment, and it is an obligation under international humanitarian law. Moreover, Israel's continuing military operations in Lebanon have already resulted in more than 500,000 people fleeing to Syria. Switzerland calls for everything possible to be done to protect them. These people and the host communities in which they find refuge are very vulnerable. To this end, Switzerland calls on the Syrian government and the main humanitarian actors to provide greater support and protection for displaced persons and host communities alike. The Syrian population must benefit from unconditional and depoliticized humanitarian aid. In this respect, I am pleased to confirm that Switzerland is contributing more than $1 million for Syria to the UN Emergency Interagency Appeal, in addition to its regular commitment. Mr. President, the world has let Syrians down twice, said Ismail al-Nasser, a 35-year-old Syrian who fled Syria 13 years ago, and Lebanon in October. We have a duty not to let them down again. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Deputy Envoy Rojdi and Director Vosorno for their briefings. I would also like to thank Mrs. Zainedine for her valuable contribution today. Mr. President, the ongoing tense and violent situation across many fronts in Syria is highly worrying, especially in combination with the escalation of violence in the wider region. The war in Gaza and the ongoing hostilities in Lebanon in particular. We urge all major stakeholders to redouble their efforts towards regional de-escalation in the interest of long-term peace and stability for all. In this growing regional turmoil, the implications for Syria and Syrians are alarming. Moreover, this is happening on our watch. Once again, tens of thousands of Syrians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times, are fleeing for their lives. Once again, they're forced to relive the nightmare of displacement, despair, and uncertainty. Most of those who are returning back to Syria are doing so under aversive conditions and extreme pressure. These people, women, children, and older persons in particular, are in a situation of acute vulnerability and have immense and urgent needs. In light of the situation unfolding, we call on the Syrian government to prioritize the welfare of all people on its territory with no distinction between them on religious, sectarian, ethnic, or political grounds. Enhancing cooperation with UNHCR would be a necessary step in order to ensure full humanitarian and protection needs for all. We call also on the Syrian government and de facto authorities on the ground to ensure long-term safety of the returnees. Mr. President, the Syrian crisis remains one of the world's worst and most enduring humanitarian situations. The current displacement influx from Lebanon adds an additional strain on the response. Almost 17 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. On top of that, with only a month left in the year, the humanitarian response plan for Syria is only at 28%, as mentioned by Director Vosorno earlier. We echo the appeal of humanitarians to urgently and significantly increase support for humanitarian efforts in Syria. In addition, to cope with the scale of the situation, all forms of aid delivery, including cross-border aid and aid delivered across the front lines, remain crucial. Humanitarian actors need greater predictability to plan their activities, and they must be able to conduct their work safely. As the situation is becoming more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing day, we call on all actors, Syrian and international, including Israel, to comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reiterate our full support to Special Envoy's efforts and we call on the Syrian government to engage in a political process towards a sustainable and comprehensive political solution in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Deputy Special Envoy Ms. Rushdie and OCHA Director Ms. Gosorn for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Sosan for her very powerful remarks. The conflict in Lebanon that has escalated since September continues to have a profound impact on Syria, with 540,000 Syrians and Lebanese reported to have entered the country, 75% of whom are women and children. In addition, Israeli airstrikes on targets inside Syria have escalated, resulting in an increase in civilian casualties. Conflict in Gaza and Lebanon must not spill over into the entire region and cause further tragedy. Japan once again calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. We also urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint and work diligently toward a diplomatic solution in order to avoid further escalation in the region. Japan has done its utmost to provide assistance to those facing difficulty. On October 29th, in response to the deteriorating situation in Syria affected by conflict in Lebanon, the government of Japan decided to provide a new emergency grant aid, which amounts to $10 million. Through this financial outlay, we will provide humanitarian assistance such as daily necessities, food, water, and sanitation through UNHCR, WFP, UNICEF, and UNDP. Mr. President, even putting the spillover from Lebanon aside, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely serious. According to the UN, contributions to the humanitarian response plan are only 28% of what was requested. As to the problems caused by Lebanon crisis, only 17% of the emergency appeal announced in September has been collected. We continue to call on all donors to provide whatever assistance they can to address urgent need of the population. If the necessary funds are not raised before winter sets in, the people of Syria could face even harsher conditions. While we must deal with other pressing issues, we must not abandon Syrian people. Mr. President, we emphasize that the only solution to the political stalemate in Syria is to advance Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. It is regrettable that more than 2 years have passed since the last meeting of the Constitutional Committee and people's expectations are waning, so we strongly urge that the meeting be held as soon as possible. In this connection, we note that the 22nd meeting of the Astana process was held in November 11 to 12 in Kazakhstan. We hope that this process will promote confidence building among the parties concerned. Also, we note that Special Envoy Pedersen is currently visiting the region, including Damascus, and we hope that meaningful discussions will take place with stakeholders. Mr. President, it is unacceptable that the tragic situation of Syrian people continues due to the deadlock in the political process. We call on all parties to resolve the conflict through dialogue so that the flames that are rising in the region can be extinguished and the Syrian people and other innocents can return to living in peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and Director Wosornu for their briefings, and I also thank Ms. Zainuddin for sharing her powerful testimony with us today. The Syrian people, already profoundly vulnerable after enduring 14 years of conflict, need peace, stability, and political support more than ever. Yet, the region remains on the precipice. Just last week, airstrikes in Damascus claimed 15 lives and injured 16 more. Additional reports indicate that at least 36 people have been killed in strikes on Palmyra on Wednesday. Airstrikes in Lebanon have resulted in the displacement of nearly 500,000 people across the border into Syria. We have seen reports detailing engineering and construction work along the Alpha Line, encroaching into the area of separation. These are reported violations of the UNDF agreement. Such actions escalate tensions and potentially threaten the viability of this 50-year-old ceasefire. Mr. President, the humanitarian needs arising from Syria's protracted conflict are immense. Over 16.7 million people, including 7.4 million children, are in urgent and critical need of support. In this vein, we are deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in northeast Syria, including reports of large-scale attacks targeting civilian infrastructure. This has resulted in disruptions to the provision of electricity and water, directly impacting civilians. We commend the efforts of the UN and its partners in reaching millions across Syria each month. Nevertheless, we regret the chronic underfunding of the humanitarian response plan. Put simply, there are no further reductions that can be made without undermining the UN's ability to respond. Urgent and increased support, particularly in early recovery, livelihoods, and resilience programming, is essential to preserve life and dignity in Syria. We stress the importance of adopting a whole-of-Syria approach in our early recovery to make sure that humanitarian aid is not weaponized by the regime. The most direct routes, both cross-border and cross-line, must be facilitated by all parties for as long as humanitarian needs persist. This is particularly critical as we approach the harsh winter months. In this regard, we welcome the renewal of the Bab al-Hawa crossing in the north for a 3-month period. Mr. President, the implementation of Resolution 2254 remains paramount. We deeply regret the continued lack of progress on this front. We once again call for the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire to be respected by all parties in the region. Without these steps, we risk a profound unraveling of the fragile foundation for peace. All parties must end their prevarications and commit to the resumption of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Malta reaffirms its strong support for the UN's independent institution on missing persons and emphasizes the importance of carrying out its mandate in a gender-responsive and survivor-centered manner. To conclude, Mr. President, after 14 years of war, Syria's future remains hanging by a thread. Its economy, security, and society are in ruins. While millions of Syrian people have fled to nearby Lebanon in that time, fearful of returning, we now see the fear of Israeli bombardment forcing nearly 500,000 to return. This and the threat of a major conflict in the region threaten to push Syria into total collapse. We once again reiterate that our responsibility is to stop this from happening. This is the responsibility of this Council. Those with influence over the parties must ensure that Syrian civilians are protected from devastating conflicts of an all-out regional war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Guyana. At the outset, the A3+ would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rushdie and OCHA Director Edem Wasserno for their valuable briefings. We also listened carefully to the representative of civil society. Mr. President, the escalating tensions in the Middle East is further complicating the path to peace and stability in Syria. Recent developments, including renewed violations of Syria's sovereignty, undermine Syria's fragile stability and exacerbate the suffering of its people. Such actions not only violate international law, but also risk reigniting a devastating cycle of violence and terrorism. The A3+ is deeply alarmed by these developments and underscores the urgent need for all actors in the region to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize dialogue over confrontation. Syria must be spared from further military escalation. The resurgence of terrorism within Syria serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of a comprehensive political solution to the crisis, one that ensures Syria's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, as outlined in Resolution 2254. In this regard, we emphasize the need to reinvigorate the Constitutional Committee and call on all stakeholders to engage constructively with the Special Envoy to break the current political deadlock. We remain convinced that an inclusive dialogue among Syrians, supported by the international community, is the only viable path to a sustainable and just resolution to this protracted crisis. The A3+ calls on all parties to demonstrate the political will necessary to restore peace and stability in Syria. Mr. President, the dire humanitarian situation in Syria, exacerbated by the influx of refugees from Lebanon, has left an already estimated 16.7 million people in need, while limited funding resources further hinder efforts to address these challenges. 540,000 people have fled to Syria, a high proportion of them female-headed households, placing an additional strain on both the Syrian government and the humanitarian community, which are already struggling to meet their basic needs. The A3+ urges all parties to ensure the security of displaced persons, protect and respect their human rights, and create an environment that allows for the free movement of humanitarian organizations to reach the most vulnerable populations. We express our deep concerns over the insufficient funding for both the humanitarian response plan and the flash appeal, and call on donors to honor their commitments in this regard. The A3+ welcomes the decision of the Syrian government to extend for an additional 3 months the authorization granted to the UN and humanitarian agencies to use the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings. In this regard, we underscore the critical importance of all mechanisms, including the cross-border and cross-line mechanisms, for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Syria. The A3+ has consistently advocated for the urgent need for early recovery projects to ensure an effective humanitarian response. Restoring the health system must be a priority, especially in light of the suspected cholera cases in Al-Hasaka, which highlight the urgent need for action. The A3+ calls on all member states to engage positively with the UN efforts to implement an early recovery strategy, including by lifting unilateral sanctions. The future of Syrians depends on creating an environment conducive to their safe, voluntary, and dignified return to their homes. Mr. President, the Middle East stands at a critical crossroads, and we cannot afford to witness the outbreak of another conflict, particularly in Syria, which has already been ravaged by 13 years of crisis. It is imperative that we all work together to prevent the recurrence of violence in Syria and to find a lasting solution to the crisis that continues to shake the country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, President. We're grateful to the Deputy Special Envoy Rochi and Director Wosornu for the information they provided. I've taken due note of the statement made by the representative of civil society, and I also welcome the presence of permanent representatives from Syria, Iran, and Turkey in the room. Mr. President, on this occasion, once again, I would like to address 3 aspects of concern to my delegation regarding the situation in Syria. Firstly, on the stalemated political negotiations and the lack of will shown by the parties to explore any other scenario, my delegation underscores the fact that the only possible solution to the situation in Syria is political. For that reason, today more than ever, the provisions of Resolution 2254 remain relevant. The Constitutional Committee, as the comprehensive strategy for dialogue between the government, the opposition, and civil society and other interested countries, must be revived without delay. We encourage Special Envoy Peterson to spare no diplomatic efforts to find an alternative venue for the Constitutional Committee. 2, a new humanitarian crisis is looming with an increase in the number of persons forcibly displaced, including Syrians, Palestinians, and Lebanese. 75% of the IDPs are women and children and persons with disabilities, and their levels of exposure and vulnerability have risen with the worsening tensions. These displacements exacerbate the situation in the country where 2 out of every 3 people is in need of humanitarian assistance just to survive. The international community must respond to the UN emergency appeal for $324 million additional in order to address emerging needs in the humanitarian response plan. The Bab al-Salam and Al-Ray crossings will remain operational until the 13th of February 2025. The commitment of the Syrian government here must remain steadfast in order to guarantee predictability and sustainability of humanitarian assistance. And third, the repercussions of the regional conflict have already shown the feared knock-on effect with an escalation of violence in Syrian territory. My delegation is concerned about the extremely sensitive situation in the region and the reluctance of the parties to show moderation and constraint. Mr. President, 13 years after the start of the conflict in Syria and after all the efforts by the international community to support an intra-Syrian process to restore peace, it is now time to give dialogue a chance. This is the only way to ensure peace and security in Syria, and in this way to allow peace to spread throughout the entire region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would like to thank Ms. Rochdi and Woznornu for their statements and for Ms. Zinedine for her extremely eloquent briefing and for telling us all about the situation facing the Syrians. After 14 years almost of war and Damascus's refusal to take into account the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people, the prospects for a regional spillover that might reach Syria must be avoided. Current tensions bring new burdens to the Syrian people, accompanied by the uptick in Daesh's actions, the traffic of Captagon, and ongoing violence of the Syrian regime and their proxies against the Syrian population. We've repeatedly reiterated undertaking a credible political process that meets the aspirations of the Syrians is the only way of achieving a fair and lasting peace. Due to this, we reiterate our support for Geir Pedersen and the implementation of 2254 in all its components. We reiterate that we are ready, once there is a tangible and verifiable progress seen in the political process, to start lifting sanctions. The fleeing of 500,000 people of Lebanese and Syrians from Libya, Lebanese rather, and Syrians from Lebanon to Syria shows the impact of regional tensions. And France is very concerned by reports of arrests, forced disappearance, and other serious violations of the rights of Syrians who've returned from Lebanon. We need to continue to exert pressure on the Syrian regime for it to lift obstacles to a safe return of refugees, and France is working with the UNHCR and its partners here. The humanitarian situation is dire. Winter is going to further test a population that's exhausted after more than 13 years of war. The most vulnerable people are going to be affected deeply by the cold. A lot of people are at risk of famine, and so there is a need for us to rally, to mobilize more financing, and France is financing a pilot project through the WFP to guarantee affordable bread for 250,000 people displaced in the northwest. France would reiterate the vital nature of a cross-border delivery of humanitarian aid. We call upon the Syrian regime to authorize, without any time limits, the use of the Bab el-Salam, Al-Rai, and Bab el-Hawa crossing points. At the same time, it's crucial to continue efforts to enable assistance to be delivered across the front lines. France reiterate the fact that international humanitarian law must be upheld by all stakeholders in Syria.
And I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Rashidi, Director Wasronu, for their briefings. I also convey my special gratitude to Ms. Zainadine for her testimonies, which were truly inspiring. It is deeply worrisome that the security situation in Syria has further worsened ever since the last briefing. The escalation over the past week, including intense airstrike in Damascus, northeast Syria, and Palmyra, show no sign of abating. In this context, I would like to make the following 3 points. First, we reiterate our call for all parties to recommit to the political process outlined in Resolution 2254. While Syria's security landscape is deeply interconnected with regional dynamics, the political process under the resolution remains the only agreed-upon framework for achieving sustainable peace in the country. As such, we urge all parties to uphold the principles enshrined in the resolution, including the preservation of territorial integrity and the protection of the rights of all Syrians. Second, we call on Syria to provide answers to the families of missing and arbitrarily detained persons regarding their fate. Ensuring the human rights of all Syrians is more crucial than ever, particularly with the anticipated arrival of more refugees from Lebanon. Yet, progress on addressing the critical issue of detained and the missing persons remains limited, despite the passage of time. In this context, we acknowledge the recent report of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, IIMP, which outlines its notable achievements since its establishment last April. We commend the IIMP for its steadfast efforts in clarifying the fate of missing persons through extensive outreach and engagement. However, it is deeply concerning that the IIMP has not yet appointed its head, despite the 6 months of operational activity. We reiterate our call for the immediate appointment of its leadership, as such progress will serve as a vital confidence-building measure and advance Special Envoy Peterson's step-by-step approach. Third, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria demands both immediate and long-term responses. A cholera outbreak, alarming food insecurity, and the approaching winter exemplify the urgent need for the international community to address the funding gap currently filled at only 28%. In this context, the Republic of Korea has contributed $26 million to support the Syrian refugees in the region and urges other donor countries to act swiftly to help mitigate escalating crisis. Furthermore, over a decade of humanitarian crisis in Syria highlights the great need for both sustainability and resilience in our efforts. In this regard, we commend OCHA's launch of the Early Recovery Strategy 2024-28, which represent a critical step toward fostering a long-term recovery of the country. In closing, my delegation calls on all parties to urgently cease hostilities, protect the civilians at all costs, and recommit to a political solution that ensures lasting peace, security, and prosperity in Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I wish to thank DSE Rushdie and Director Wosonou for their briefings. Over the past month, Israel has continued to carry out airstrikes against Syria, causing casualties. The actions by Israel gravely violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. China expresses strong condemnation. Such actions must cease immediately. The protracted conflict in Gaza and the escalating situation between Lebanon and Israel have plunged the entire region into uncertainty and instability. In this context, the international community must work together to effectively prevent the further growth and spread of the conflict, as it will lead to even greater disasters. China calls on parties concerned to effectively respect the sovereignty, security, and the territorial integrity of Syria and immediately cease their illegal military actions against Syria. Foreign forces must end their illegal military presence in Syria as soon as possible. The rising tensions between Lebanon and Israel recently has caused an influx of more than 500,000 refugees into Syria, further exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation there. China applauds the positive actions taken by the UN agencies in their efforts to provide emergency humanitarian assistance to those in need. We welcome the Syrian government's decision to extend the authorization for the relevant border crossings and commend the government's efforts in making proper arrangement to host refugees. We call on the parties to respond positively to the urgent appeals by the humanitarian agencies such as UNHCR, scale up humanitarian input for Syria, honor the donor commitments in a timely manner, and ensure the smooth implementation of humanitarian projects in Syria so as to help improve the humanitarian situation in the country. China reiterates that the unilateral sanctions imposed against Syria by certain countries should be lifted without delay, and that the illegal plundering of Syrian resources should stop forthwith in order to create favorable conditions for the Syrian economy to recover and develop. President, China firmly supports the general direction of a political solution to the Syrian issue and the comprehensive facilitation of the political process in accordance with the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned principle. We welcome the efforts by Special Envoy Patterson in line with this principle. We look forward to the coordination among various existing dialogue mechanisms and render assistance to the political solution on the basis of communication and consultation with the Syrian government. China firmly supports the Syrian government in its efforts to fight terrorism. We call on the international community to reject double standards in accordance with international law and Council resolutions and join hands in the spirit of zero tolerance to support the Syrian government in combating terrorist forces within its borders. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of the United Kingdom. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and Director Wosornu for their briefings. I would also like to thank Sorsan Abu Zainuddin for her incredibly powerful testimony today. As we have heard today from Ms. Zainuddin, there is a vibrant community of civil society actors who stand ready to support the Syrian political process, accountability efforts, and humanitarian work with dynamism and tenacity. Where members of this Council have failed to back resolutions in the interests of the Syrian people, civil society actors have stepped in, creatively unblocking issues that have regretfully become politicised. I commend their tireless work to advocate on behalf of Syrians for a better and peaceful Syria, but particularly to lend a voice to those who cannot speak up for fear of the regime. The work of civil society organisations like Madaniya serves as an important reminder of why so many Syrians took to the streets in 2011 and continue to protest peacefully for change. Let me be clear. We remain firm in our pursuit of a political settlement in line with Resolution 2254. We urge all parties to recommit to the political process. However, if we are to achieve lasting peace, we must make sure it empowers ordinary Syrians rather than the regime and its backers. We must actively involve and consult civil society, and I encourage you all to listen to their fresh ideas. Colleagues, in the absence of a political settlement and amidst regional escalation, the security situation in Syria is as dangerous as ever. Syrians continue to experience horrific levels of violence. As people flee from Lebanon into Syria, displaced civilians must be protected and given safe passage. not only when using border crossings, which have been subject to airstrikes, but also once inside Syria, which remains unsuitable for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns at scale. We acknowledge that Syrian authorities have allowed UNHCR and others to monitor arrivals and respond to needs. We are closely monitoring the treatment of these civilians in Syria, including deeply concerning reports of arrests. All parties must do everything possible to protect civilians and fully comply with international humanitarian law. Finally, to respond to the remarks of our Russian colleague about briefers, we invite civil society briefers to the Council to provide a civilian perspective, to speak truth to power, and to hold us all to account, no matter how uncomfortable that may feel. Representing an organisation that consults across a wide group of over 200 CSOs within and outside Syria, Ms. Abu Zainuddin has done precisely that today. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Mr. President, the Israeli occupation entity continues its brutal aggression against the countries and peoples of our region, emboldened by the Security Council's inability to fulfill its responsibilities. It continues to intensify its heinous attacks on our territory, targeting, on an almost daily basis, houses, residential buildings and neighborhoods that host diplomatic missions and premises, UN offices, economic facilities, and civilian infrastructure, killing dozens and injuring hundreds of innocent civilians, including women and children, and causing massive destruction and financial losses to public and private properties. The occupation entity is also deliberately targeting border crossings, roads, and bridges connecting Syria and Lebanon, which are used by hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the Israeli killing machine from Lebanon. In a flagrant violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement, the Israeli occupation forces continue their aggression on Syrian territory from the occupied Syrian Golan. Recently, they have dug trenches and erected earthen embankments along the ceasefire line in the northern and southern parts of the separation zone. UNDOF has previously investigated Israeli engineering activities, including a trench 350 meters long and 6 meters wide, as well as other violations such as agricultural land clearing and road construction. The Syrian delegation has informed the UN Secretariat of these violations, and UNDOF has reported on them. Today, we once again warn of the danger posed by such Israeli acts of aggression aimed at creating a new reality in the region. We expect the Security Council to take prompt and decisive action to stop the aggression and put an end to all violations and crimes committed by Israeli occupation forces against Syrian territory. The latest crime took place yesterday when the Israeli entity launched an airstrike from Al-Tanf, where US troops are illegally present, targeting several buildings in Palmyra and the Syrian desert, killing 36 people and injuring dozens, while also causing significant material damage to the targeted buildings and surrounding areas.
The Syrian Arab Republic reaffirms its inalienable, inherent right to defend its sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and to reclaim its occupied territories, a right guaranteed by international law. Mr. President, the escalation of Israeli acts of aggression on Syrian territories is coupled with an intensification of attacks by terrorist groups, especially Jabhat al-Nusra Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, listed by the Security Council. This is a clear indication of the organic ties and close collaboration between these terrorist groups and the Israeli entity to commit criminal acts, including shelling civilians in surrounding areas with drones and rockets. In northern eastern Syria, these groups continue to impose their extremist ideologies and terrorist practices such as killing, torture, enforced disappearances, child recruitment, and violence against women and girls, taking advantage of the support they receive from some Western states. Mr. President, the United States and Turkey continue to violate Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. They continue to violate the UN Charter and international law by insisting to maintain their illegal military presence on Syrian soil. At the same time, they are supporting separatist and terrorist groups and looting Syrian national resources at the expense of the Syrian people. The Syrian Arab Republic stresses the need to respect its sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity, and emphasizes the need for an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all foreign military forces illegally present on its territory. Mr. President, the brutal Israeli aggression on Lebanon, on brotherly Lebanon, has led to a massive wave of displacement. The Syrian Arab Republic opened its doors and mobilized its resources to welcome hundreds of thousands of Lebanese displaced persons, Syrian returnees, and third country nationals. To date, around 600,000 people have entered Syria, 71% of whom are Syrians. The Syrian government, in collaboration with the United Nations, humanitarian partners, and civil, including the UNHCR and OCHA, and other humanitarian partners and civil society organizations, continues to provide them with the necessary services despite the significant challenges and difficult circumstances it is facing. In this vein, we call for supporting our humanitarian response efforts and providing adequate funding, while also fulfilling the relevant appeals launched by the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the large number of Syrians returning from Lebanon to Syria and the multifaceted facilitations provided by the Syrian government, which we have repeatedly explained, though some have turned a deaf ear, unequivocally refute Western claims about the return of Syrian refugees. It is high time for certain states to stop repeating such unrealistic allegations and outdated conditionalities. Syria remains committed to improving the humanitarian and living conditions of all Syrians across the country. To this end, the Syrian government renewed the authorization for the United Nations to use the Bab al-Salam and al-Ra'i crossings for an additional 3 months to ensure aid reaches its intended civilian beneficiaries in northwestern Syria.
We emphasize the need to support the resilience of all Syrians, including returnees, through serious and tangible engagement in early recovery projects, livelihood initiatives, and the provision of essential services. We also stress the need to eliminate the adverse effects of the so-called parameters and principles of UN assistance in Syria, known as the Feltman Paper. It is completely antagonistic, and it goes against basic humanitarian principles. It deprives most vulnerable groups, particularly women and children, of adequate living conditions. Additionally, we call for the full, immediate, and unconditional lifting of unilateral coercive measures, which they are illegal and unethical, and they represent a collective punishment on Syrians and deprive them of their most basic needs. Mr. President, in its final statement, the recent Arab Islamic Summit hosted by the Brotherly Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a few days ago strongly condemned Israeli aggression against Syria. It called upon the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities, take the necessary firm action to end the occupation crimes, and implement its relevant resolutions to end the Israeli occupation of Arab land, including the occupied Syrian Golan. I would also like to highlight the 22nd meeting of the guarantor states on Syria in the Asitana format, held in the capital of Kazakhstan on November 11 and 12. The final statement reaffirmed the commitment to Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. It also pledged to continue joint efforts to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, while opposing separatist agendas aimed at undermining Syria's unity and territorial integrity. The statement also condemned the repeated Israeli attacks on Syria's sovereignty. My country, Syria, reaffirms its commitment to a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political process without any foreign interference and with full respect for our sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. We reaffirm that we will continue to cooperate and engage in dialogue with the UN Special Envoy within his mandate as a facilitator. He is currently in Damascus, and he will be holding discussions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is unfortunate that the current president of the Security Council did not respect the procedures. It used it to serve its own agendas in an attempt to violate a member state for clear targets, namely to repel the statements and the commitment of the Syrian government, which is opening border crossings, continuing its daily work, and welcoming returnees. The second goal is to cover up for the crimes of Israel and the support provided by member states, as we have seen yesterday by the US veto of the E10 draft resolution, a resolution that was supported by 14 states. This resolution would have stopped the Israeli aggression. It would have protected the rights of the Palestinian people and saved lives. The goal is clear. In Syria, we have hundreds of civil society organizations.
We have thousands of courageous volunteers working night and day in partnership with the Syrian government and state institutions as well as the United Nations. We are proud of them. We are working with them to improve the humanitarian situation and living conditions of the Syrians, to provide the support needed by Syrians. Currently, we are also providing support to Syrians coming from Lebanon at the borders. They are working night and day to provide all the services necessary in line with their capacities and despite the difficult challenges. Unfortunately, their efforts are being covered up. They are not getting a chance to present their views in front of you, to talk to you about the challenges they are facing on a daily basis because of the politicization of humanitarian work, because of the lack of funding, because of the coercive measures that represent a collective punishment, depriving Syrians of their most basic rights, including the right to electricity. Due to the unilateral coercive sanctions and the continuous U.S. looting of our oil, they are depriving them of their grains. These are realities. But you're not bringing whoever is working on the ground, whoever is working in the humanitarian field on Syrian soil. You are promoting one selective view. This is unacceptable. This is politicization by the Security Council presidency. This is a very selective approach that is not credible, that is not objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, the situation in Syria remains dire, exacerbated by Israeli escalating violence and aggression across the region. In coordination with terrorist group, Israeli occupying regime is deliberately pursuing a systematic policy aimed at crippling the infrastructure of Syrian Arab Republic. Relentless airstrike and systematic acts of aggression by this regime on Syrian territory have reached unprecedented level, targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. These criminal acts flagrantly violate Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, international law, and the UN Charter. Regrettably, Israel's impunity is perpetuated by unwavering U.S. support and inaction of the Security Council, as evidenced by yesterday's U.S. veto. This disgraceful veto not only highlights the Security Council failure to uphold its charter-based mandate, but also serves as a U.S.-granted license for occupying regime to continue its carnage in Gaza and Lebanon with full impunity. This has undermined humanitarian affairs and poses a grave threat to regional and global peace. We reiterate once again our call on the Security Council to act decisively to end Israeli impunity. The Council must hold Israel accountable for its violation of international law and ensure the protection of civilians. If left unchecked, Israel's ongoing crime risks igniting a catastrophic war with global repercussions. Mr. President, as highlighted in today's UN briefing, the humanitarian needs in Syria remain immense. Years of foreign occupation, terrorism, and unilateral sanctions has devastated Syria's economy. The United States and its allies persist in their failed policy of inhuman unilateral sanction, using them as a tool for the collective punishment of the Syrian people. These actions are both illegal and morally indefensible and must be lifted immediately. Meanwhile, the United States and certain European countries such as the United Kingdom are politicizing humanitarian aid and obstructing international efforts to support Syrian reconstruction. These harmful policies have only prolonged the conflict and exacerbated the suffering of the Syrian people. Furthermore, Israel's relentless strikes on border crossing between Syria and Lebanon have disrupted critical aid deliveries and forced hundreds of thousands to flee. Over 500,000 people have sought refuge in Syria from Lebanon, placing overwhelming on Syrian already overstretched resources and host communities. The humanitarian response to this crisis demands urgent and substantial international support. Despite these immense challenges, the Syrian government continues to demonstrate remarkable resilience. We commend its steadfast efforts to mobilize resources for assisting refugees, including those recently displaced from Lebanon. We also welcome the Syrian government decision to extend the permission for the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossing for an additional 3 months to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in northwest Syria. This decision underscores Syria's commitment to alleviating the suffering of its people despite external pressure. The international community must increase support for Syria to address the urgent needs of refugees. Early recovery projects are essential for rebuilding infrastructure and creating conditions for the safe return of refugees and displaced persons. Mr. President, terrorism remains a significant threat in Syria, particularly in Idlib, where terrorist groups continue to operate. Addressing this threat requires full respect for Syrians' sovereignty and territorial integrity. Iran remains firmly committed to the Astana process, which provides a viable framework for resolving the crisis. During the 22nd meeting of the Astana format held on 11 and 12 November in Kazakhstan, the parties reviewed the recent development in Syria and reaffirmed their steadfast commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. They underscored that adherence to these principles is essential for achieving lasting peace and stability in Syria and the broader region. Iran reaffirms its commitment to a political resolution of the Syrian crisis. A political solution led and owned by Syrians is the only viable path to resolving the Syrian crisis. Any sustainable solution must fully uphold Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the illegal presence of foreign forces, particularly U.S. forces, halt the exploitation of Syria's natural resources, and cease ongoing support by the U.S. and Israel for terrorist groups. Iran fully supports the resumption of the Constitutional Committee meeting to advance meaningful political dialogue. We also welcome the Special Envoy's active engagement with Syrian authorities, particularly his ongoing visit to Damascus, as a vital step toward fostering progress in political process. The Syrian people deserve peace, dignity, and the opportunity to rebuild their nation free from external interference. Through collective efforts, we can restore peace and stability in Syria and in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Syria remains a central and painful chapter in the ongoing crises affecting the Middle East. While the focus often shifts to emerging crises, the unresolved situation in Syria continues to demand the urgent attention of the international community. The situation in the broader region has worsened the humanitarian crisis and triggered mass displacement. Since the recent escalation of hostilities and Israel's destabilizing actions across the region, we have seen a sharp increase in displacement to Syria. More than 500,000 people have crossed from Lebanon into Syria, according to UNHCR. Alarmingly, 71% of the displaced are Syrians, with women and children making up the majority. children alone represent over half. In such dire circumstances, the international community must shoulder its responsibilities. Yet, humanitarian efforts remain underfunded. As Director Wosornu has warned, the UN's humanitarian response plan faces critical funding shortfalls, which threaten the ability to deliver life-saving assistance. Donors must step up and avoid any further cuts to funding and support early recovery efforts. The uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid remains vital, particularly in view of the new waves of migration that brings an additional strain. Turkey is fully committed to facilitating these efforts and will continue to ensure assistance reaches to those in need. Mr. President, Turkey is fully committed to Syria's territorial integrity and unity. Yet, Syria's already bleak humanitarian and political situation is further aggravated by terrorism. The presence of terrorist organizations within Syria undermines the country's unity and territorial integrity while posing a direct threat to Turkey's national security. No country can stand idle by repeated terrorist attacks to its territory and people. Indeed, the October 23rd deadly terrorist attack in Ankara underscored the urgent need to root out terrorist elements in Syria. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF infiltrated Turkey from Syrian territory. I'd like to emphasize that Turkey is entitled to take appropriate measures against this direct and imminent threat in accordance with its inherent right of self-defense. Turkey's counter-terrorism operations exclusively target terrorists and their capabilities, and utmost care is accorded to avoid any harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF, we will continue to counter their efforts against my country. A truly unified effort is needed to combat terrorism in all its forms without distinction. Eliminating these threats is a prerequisite for achieving stability in Syria and the region. Mr. President, the escalating violence in the Middle East threatens to engulf Syria further. It is imperative to insulate Syria from additional destabilizing actions and to work collectively towards a stable and peaceful future. Turkey is fully committed to this goal. We envision a Syria where a real and sustainable national consensus is achieved, with the international community playing a constructive role. A unified security structure is achieved, the safe and dignified return of displaced Syrians are guaranteed, and regional peace is not undermined by the export of instability to neighbors. These objectives cannot be realized without the removal of all terrorist elements, including Daesh and PKK-YPG, from Syrian territory. Equally, the political process must be revitalized in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Current developments should not distract us from this ultimate goal. We continue our efforts in the Astana format, among others. We also support the efforts of UN Special Envoy Pedersen to reconvene the Constitutional Committee. Mr. President, the Syrian conflict continues to inflict immeasurable suffering. The international community must remain steadfast in its commitment to Syria. My country stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at achieving a credible political solution. We will continue to work with UN agencies and relevant stakeholders to address the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.